Welcome. My name's Sarah Bowder, SDSU Agronomy Field Specialist, and today I'm here with Dr. Julie Walker, Extension Beef Specialist with SDSU Extension, as well as Doug Seek, who is a diversified crop and livestock operator near Selby, South Dakota. And we are going to be discussing salvaging drought stressed crops, specifically today, grazing corn and how we can do that. Is it possible? What are some of the considerations we need to make before we decide to try it? So Julie, let's start a little bit with you in your research and background with Extension. I know you've done some work with grazing corn. What are some things producers should think about, be aware of before they make the decision to do so? And how do we make that decision?
Okay, so the first thing I always tell producers is they need to think about the herbicides that they've applied. So is there a herbicide that they've applied that would not allow them to graze? So if they can scratch that off, then grazing is still an option. Then the second thing I think about is nitrates. So if they're shooting for 150 bushel corn, and they put on that much N, we know that nitrogen gets moved up the plant as nitrates during drought, stress. It gets tied up in the plant. Typically, I always think the bottom third to bottom half of the plant is usually where I think most of the nitrates are at. But they potentially want to test that. Now, this is a rule of thumb I've used with producers, but that's not saying you still should not test this. If you have decent grain on the ears, usually nitrates aren't a problem. And we've found that over years and years of testing that that's pretty true. Now, there's no research to back that up, but typically you can start thinking there'll probably be less nitrate issues. And then I would like them to potentially estimate how much corn or how many bushels of corn there is per acre. And you want to do that just so that you can go about how we're going to moderate those cattle or how we're going to manage them when we graze them. And so those are the kind of things. The other thing they need to think about is, are they going to have a really good water supply out there? So that, and with the lack of fences, how are they going to meet the fence requirement for South Dakota law and those kind of things. And so those, once they have those things checked, yes, then the things that they need to think about is, I kind of break them into 4 areas. What type of livestock do they want to graze? If cows have grazed corn stalks before, corn before, they're really good at finding the ears. They are excellent. I think they have like a nose of a dog when it comes to finding ears. And so they'll go to the grain. And so typically we have different management if we put calves or yearlings in, that what we would call naive to grazing standing corn, because it's going to take them a little longer to find the corn. And then that allows the rumen to be adapted better to when they get that corn. And so they need to think about what class of livestock they want to put out there. The next thing I think about is adapting that rumen. So being a ruminant nutritionist by training, I got to go back to that. We can't just go from a grass-based diet to a really high grain diet without potentially causing some metabolic issues or some digestion upsets. And so to avoid those, no matter what class of livestock you're going to put out there, I would suggest adapting them to some corn, doing it over a couple weeks, ideally, maybe starting with 3 pounds, taking them up to 7, 8 pounds, something like that. Typically, I think you can do that pretty safely in a couple weeks time if you want to. The third thing to get them out there and graze, once you know how much corn is out there, how much of the plant you want to graze, so they can take, okay, maybe I want to make sure they only take the leaves and the ears and maybe just the top part of the plant because we're worried about nitrates in the bottom half. This is how much forage I have out there. So what's that area? So can we do a 1 day grazing area with hot wire or cross fencing or whatever, or a couple days to limit how much area those cattle will have access to, and then move them along. And the fourth thing you can kind of do is look for the amount of corn in the manure. And so if you're not seeing any corn in the manure, and this, I'm saying the fresh manure, not the stuff that's a few days old, then you may want to move them just due to the fact that they may be getting too deep into the stalks, and that might be a risk for nitrates. And so those are some things I think about, or producers should think about, or when I visit with producers, that's kind of the things we kind of toss around to make our nice little checklist of what we need to do.
So there's definitely some things we need to look at first. And like you mentioned, herbicide is probably going to throw some people out of the game right off the bat. And I'm not sure if you mentioned it or not, Julie, but crop insurance. If you do have crop insurance, make sure you check with your crop insurance agent and FSA if you're in any programs, before you do anything that messes up your previous plans, if you will.
Correct. And that's what, hopefully they've done that before they called me. But herbicide is the one that usually gets them caught up in the thing. And it's like, oh, the label doesn't allow for grazing it afterwards. And so there is some precautions when we need to take for those.
Definitely. Well, with us here is Doug Seek, and Doug has quite a bit of experience with grazing corn intentionally, right, Doug? Typically, he has planted a crop for grazing, but I'd say he's our local expert in grazing standing corn for sure. And we have him here today just to discuss a little bit of some of the things that have worked for you, Doug, maybe what hasn't worked, and some tips you would give producers who have never done this that might be faced with issues this year where they're considering grazing corn. And in this case, maybe corn that doesn't have an ear or has sparse ears.
Sure, Sarah. Julie made a lot of good points, a lot of the good things you need to take into account before you start off. So I won't repeat much of that, but I agreed with what I heard. I look at it kind of from my baseline of that a cow will do just fine on 10 pounds of corn and 10 pounds of corn stalks per day. And on an average corn crop, you've got just as many pounds of fodder out there as you do grain. I know this year is different. I don't have a lot of experience with grazing drought stressed corn. So I'm going to talk to you about what I've done with regular corn, and you can adapt from there. So like Julie said, I'll work them up to about 10 pounds of corn, and I'll do it with a gravity wagon, real simple. I just start off with about 3 pounds per head per day, and I go out and I'll crack the door on the gravity wagon just a little bit, and I'll hop back in the pickup or tractor, and I'll drive around a big circle. And I'll do like Julie said, I'll take them up about a pound a day until I get to about 10 pounds. And then I'm ready to go to the cornfield. Or I can do it in the cornfield with subdivisions, but it's easier for me to work them up with a wagon or a feed wagon. Now, what I've done is to estimate what the yield is out there. I'll just I'll measure off part of the row, and I'll walk down the row, and I'll pull ears off and put them in a 5-gallon bucket, and I'll just weigh the bucket. Gives me an idea of what's out there. And then I just do the math. If I've got 100 cows and I want 10 pounds per cow per day, want 1,000 pounds, I figure out how many pounds are out there per square acre, and I do it from there. I go from there. Typically for, 160 cows or so, I usually end up with about 2 acres, something like that. So it's about 30 rows wide and about 80 yards long, just to give you a reference point on a normal year. I think the fields are all going to be a little bit different. If there are a few ears out there, I think that's where I'd start. I'd estimate how much corn is out there per acre, and I'd sure adjust according from that because I don't want to get too much or too little corn. You get that. What I use is poly wire, and I've got cows that are really used to electric fence. So I've got a really big fencer back in the yard, and so they're kind of trained up, and they have a lot of respect. And the thing with that is, if I'm feeding 10 pounds of corn and 10 pounds of corn stalks, they're eating 20 pounds a day, and they're used to eating 40. So they're going to be hungry. They're going to be looking around, and so you have to adapt to that. Now, I don't always stick with 10 pounds. If I want to put a little more on them and the corn isn't expensive, I've gone up to about 20 pounds of corn per day and corn stalks accordingly. And then I'll also feed protein. I'll feed alfalfa on Mondays and Thursdays to give them a little shot of protein if I can. Sometimes I'll put out some baking soda. You can buy 50-pound bags of baking soda and just put it in a salt feeder with a lid. And that kind of helps buffer them when they're going back and forth on the thing. So on a typical year, you know, I'll combine 30 rows, and then I'll leave 30 rows, then I'll combine 6 or 12, and I'll leave, you know, 12. I'll leave 30, then I'll combine 6 or 12, and then I'll go down to whatever my calculation is, and I'll drive crossways with the four-wheeler pulling a truck tire behind it to knock the stalks down, and it's somewhat to give me a place to run the fence, but it gives the cows a visual that when I come to that spot, something's different here. I bet, and they look for the string a little more, you know. So what I've been thinking, if I'm adapting over to grazing drought-stressed corn, if it's drought-stressed corn that's got small ears and 40-pound test weight corn, I'll use that method. Okay, you know, I'll pick some off and weigh them and see what I've got. If it's really drought-stressed corn and there aren't any ears out there, just an ear every now and then I'm going to switch to the method that I use for grazing corn stalks after I combine them. And I'll give a couple hundred cows 30 acres every 5 days or something like that. Doesn't matter. I'll figure out what I think they need for about 5 days worth of feed, and then I'll move them every 5 days. That does a couple of things. It keeps their plane of nutrition level. They don't just eat the good stuff and wait till the way end to eat the bad stuff. But also, if you're out on another producer's land, they can see that those cows are not staying in the same part of the field all the time. We're addressing the producer's concerns about compaction. So if you move that string or that poly wire, electric fence, whatever you're using, every 5 days, you can see those cows. They'll pretty much stay over in the new 30 acres. Maybe they'll go back in the old 30 a little bit, and if they are, it probably means you need to move a little faster. But we address the producer's concerns. And another concern that you want to address is, what are you going to do with those cows if you get into a rainy spell? Okay, you don't want to build animosity with your neighbor by pugging up his cornfield and turning it into a compaction problem. So you need to plan ahead and have a contingency plan and say, okay, if we get a big rain come in here, I'm going to try to move them over to this grassy area over here on my land until it firms up, and then I'll come back. You know, you get the idea. Work out something, okay? And for water, I've had good luck. I've had real good luck using above ground water lines. As it gets colder, that's not an option, but in the fall, it works good to just string out some of that black poly pipe, hook it up to a hydrant, and throw a tire tank out there. So most of my electric fencing on the perimeter and throughout the field is poly wire, plastic twine, electric fence string, and O'Brien original step-in plastic posts. I mention those specifically because they work really well for me in frozen and thawed ground. If I've got my choice, I'd probably like something better than a poly wire around the outside of the cornfield. If I'm over at your place, I might string wire, single strand, a high tensile wire, or even regular wire. Yeah, probably regular wire, probably not high tensile. But I'd probably run wire for the perimeter, and then I'd subdivide with the poly wire. It's worked pretty well for me. I've done it quite a few years. And then keep in mind too, as you move into this winter, if you're short on feed, if a cow can do it out in the cornfield on 10 pounds of corn and 10 pounds of corn stalks, she can do it out behind your trees on 10 pounds of corn and 10 pounds of hay, whether it's poor quality or not. And you can do it real simply with a gravity wagon. You don't need to buy a feed wagon. Just use a gravity wagon, measure out how many pounds in the scoop your loader and scoop into a pile of corn and dump it in, or run it through an auger and time it. You know, I got to put 1 minute and 38 seconds of corn in here to get 1,500 pounds. You can do this real simple and real easy and cut your hay needs back by 1/2 to 3/4, at least for part of the winter. So that's about all I've got, but feel free to call with any questions.
Doug is a wealth of knowledge. That I don't even have to ask you more questions, Doug. I think you've covered a great deal of the practical questions people ask. And like you mentioned, the fence in the water can be real holdups for people, and you've mastered that, I'd say, especially before the frost, essentially. But you know, thinking out of the box, not just in a drought year, but any year, can really save us a lot of mechanical efforts that we spend haying and, you know, putting up grain that could probably be grazed or eaten out in the field as well. But there's definitely some caution to take when we're talking about grazing standing corn, especially in a drought year like this. Julie mentioned some of those issues. Nitrates are a big one. But like Doug said, you know, grazing drought stressed corn is not necessarily the same as grazing a corn crop that you grew specifically for that purpose. But there's, you know, everyone's in a different boat, and there's still ways to do it safely as long as you're managing very intensively and paying attention to those cows out there. Anything to add, Julie or Doug, before we close?
I don't. I just think every producer is going to be different on their comfort level. And I usually tell them if they're really nervous about it, do it with some maybe, I always joke they're neighbors' cows, but in reality, I've helped producers do this for 20 some years and no one's killed any cows yet. So it is doable. They just have to take some steps, and they have to think, as you said, outside the box, and they have to be intentional on their management. It's just not, you can't go on vacation for 2 weeks and think the cows are going to be okay.
Right. Yep. And I think Doug knows that firsthand.
Julie brings up a good point. I usually give them days worth of grazing at a time when I've got a good corn. And so you've got to be around, or you've got somebody around that knows to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you to both of you. I really appreciate your time. And as Doug mentioned, any of us can be reached. Julie and I, you can find our contact information at extension.sdstate.edu. Click Our People. And Doug can be found through the Voices of Soil Health or the Soil Health Coalition. He is active with them. So we appreciate your time, and I want to thank the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition for partnering on this effort with SDSU Extension. And hopefully we will see you down the road at a program. Thank you.